and knowing my wonderful colleagues, this promises to be both a really exciting and insightful afternoon. And I think it will illustrate at least two things. One is the immense variety that characterizes the field of environmental history. It's really it's a truly interdisciplinary field and touches upon a wide range of very different questions. And secondly, the obvious relevance that the field has and has had for societal questions today. Now, I will use these 30 minutes to make a plea for more historical perspectives on sustainability questions. And I will call upon you as students to lend your much needed creativity and brain power and engagement to this effort. I must say that it's a bit awkward, a bit strange for me to be speaking to you while I'm not able to see you. I decided to not use PowerPoint slides because I myself often find it slightly boring to be looking at slides and not being able to really see the presenter. So that is why you will have to bear with me. I look forward to receiving your questions in the chat. I have the chat open, so if you have questions also during my talk, just let me know, and I will look forward to discussing some of the issues that I will raise in this talk with you. Now, let me start by telling you a brief anecdote from fall 2019. It seems ages ago. That was the time when we were still able to meet each other in person, to have classes on campus. And I was sitting on a bus. I'm working in the city center, and I was on my way to Utrecht Science Park to teach a group of RMA history, Research Master History students. We were working on a project together. It's one of the really nice courses of the Research Master of History, the research seminar, where students actually work together with their teachers in teams, in research teams on a research project together. So we were working on this project together, and we were studying the role of interest groups in European politics and European governance. And one student was working on the role of Protestant churches in European governance. Three of them were doing research in the archives of Greenpeace, and a fifth one was looking at British farmers' organizations and how their views on the European community, on the European project, had developed and had changed over time. So I was sitting on that bus on my way to class when suddenly the bus slowed down and came to a halt. Now, the bus driver announced that we could not continue our journey because of the crowds of farmers who had assembled on the roads, who had taken to the streets on their tractors. You may remember these images. They were on their way to the National Institute for Public Health and the Environment, the RIVM, which is located in Bilthoven. So they were basically blocking my road. And you may remember this was the time when tensions in the so-called nitrogen crisis, the stikstof crisis, came to a head. And this crisis broke out in response to the ruling of the Dutch Council of State, which pinpointed the farm sector as a major contributor to environmental pollution in the Netherlands. And farmers were mobilizing in protest because they were afraid of the drastic implications that this ruling would have for the size of the farm sector and for their own firms. Now, while farmers were driving their tractors to The Hague and to provincial government buildings in the fall of that year, climate activists of Extinction Rebellion, perhaps some of them are among you, were blocking the streets of Amsterdam to call for more ambitious climate policies. So it's a really interesting clash of interests. Now, what I experienced then was something that is quite rare to historians, I think. It resembled sort of a plunging into my own research project, basically an encounter with the most important actors that I'm studying, that I've been studying for a while. For a while, I've been working on the question of how the rise of nature, or what has been understood historically as nature and the environment, on the political agenda has challenged and changed ideas of and practices of democracy, of interest representation, of political representation. Right, so questions that are linked to this overarching theme are: who gets to speak in the name of the environment or nature, or future generations, or animals, or non-human animals? What I use as a key concept is that of representative claims. It's a concept that's being used by Michael Sayward, and basically what he uses the concept for is to show that political representation is not something static. It's not like you have the farm interest groups, and when they say they speak in the name of farmers, that is a given. Political representation is a dynamic process. It's a constant interaction, negotiation among those who claim to speak in the name of something, and then their constituencies, that something which can actually talk back and say, hey, wait a minute, you may state that you're speaking in our name, but we don't really feel represented. Now, of course, that is more difficult if environmental organizations or interest groups speak in the name of the environment or nature or future generations. They generally don't talk back. Animals, turns out, have their own language, but it's not a language that we are listening to or that we are hearing in the political arena. So why are some of these representative claims considered legitimate in certain periods of times, or illegitimate, and in other periods of times legitimate? Now, agriculture is a really fascinating lens through which one may approach this question. Agriculture, for a long time, it has been a policy field that has been dominated by the so-called Green Front, an alliance of farm interest groups, the Ministry of Agriculture, and Christian Democratic politicians, parties. A typical feature of the Dutch political system is its neo-corporatist structures. So policies have been made in consultation with traditional interest groups, such as employers' organizations, trade unions, and in the case of agriculture with farm interest groups. Now, this has gradually changed over the last decades, with some difficulties, but by now ecologists and nature conservation groups and environmental organizations are claiming say as well, right? So they're saying agriculture is not only about those producing agricultural products or working the land, it's also about other interests, such as the environment. And I think the protest demonstrations that we have seen in the past years may be seen as a response by farmers to this shift in governance, a shift in who is considered a stakeholder or an interested party. And this shift that we see is somewhat away from those working the land, producing agricultural products, to a much wider array of interests and groups. And I think this time is really striking, and there, the interesting historical questions come in. The first warning of the negative effects of manure surpluses. Manure surpluses basically means too much cow shit on the environment were already ventilated at the end of the 1960s. Now, the development of manure legislation, so the regulation of how much manure could be produced by cattle, by farmers, began 20 years later in the 1980s. And now, another 25 years later, we're stuck with a nitrogen crisis. It is also interesting timing for another reason, because of another reason. You may find out soon, there'll probably be newspaper articles written about it, or maybe some television programs, some reporting that on the 23rd of March 1971, which is exactly 50 years ago, there were huge farmer mobilizations, farmer protests as well, taking place in Brussels. Some 10,000 farmers from all over Europe drove to Brussels and protest, and then there was actually one person killed in these protests. And if you want to, you may have a look at on YouTube. There's several video clippings available of these protests, and it's really interesting to see some of the similarities in the repertoires and the discourses that are being used by these groups. It is interesting because these protests were a response to an earlier attempt to reform the agricultural sector. an attempt by Sikko Mansholt, former Minister of Agriculture in the Netherlands, but at the time he was the European Commissioner of Agriculture. And what he said was that it was not sustainable to keep all of the farm sector within the European community to sustain that. So the farm sector size needed to be reduced. There should no longer be the fixed prices. So the common agricultural policy of the European community stated that farmers would have sort of fixed prices, and they would have the certainty that their products, that they could sell their products. So you can imagine that this led to huge overproduction. So these butter mountains and milk lakes, they may sound familiar to you, but it was a huge problem, a huge environmental problem at the time. Sikko Mansholt also, in his Mansholt plan, said that the farm sector needed to be modernized. So no longer the small scale inefficient family farms that were still common in many of the European community member states. So mobilization of farmers, 10,000 to Brussels, and they were able to thwart this reform effort by Sikko Mansholt. And there we see kind of a path dependency, it has been argued by historians, that the fact that this first attempt to reform the sector provoked such an intensive response from farmers that made politicians and policymakers hesitant to try another reform attempt. So it would take until 1992 for the McSherry reform, so another attempt to reform the common agricultural policy. Right. So that is a historical past dependency. Because of this earlier experience, there was some fear, some dread to again confront farm interests. Now, I've been talking about farms and agriculture, and you may say, what is interesting, about these topics? They're not really my cup of tea, but the same can be observed for other topics. Take the plastic soup, for instance. That is a topic that has attracted a lot of public attention in the last years, as you all know, with media genetic surf dudes warning about the harmful effects of microplastics in oceans and calling upon you to, quote, do something good for yourself and for the world, go on a plastic diet. So what we see here is that you as an individual consumer are directly called upon to change your habits, to change your consumption patterns, and to stop using plastics. Now, the historian trying to trace the roots of the plastic problem will find similar warnings in historical newspapers expressed by environmental activists in the 1970s already. The direct occasion was the introduction of the plastic bottle by soft drinks producers like Coca-Cola. Consumer organizations and environmental organizations called upon consumers to boycott Coca-Cola because of this. Plastics, they made very clear, cost a lot of energy to produce and will be impossible to dispose of. The director of Stichting Natuur en Milieu, is one of the bigger environmental organizations in the Netherlands, warned about the microscopically small pieces of plastic that would end up in the oceans, harm seabirds and burden next generations, which means your generation, with a waste problem that is impossible to solve. Now, it will not surprise you that this did not deter the company from introducing the bottle, all the while reassuring its customers that there are perfectly environment-friendly ways to burn plastics. Such historical case studies, and I think they're wonderful topics for MA theses, raise a crucial question. Why, if the problem was already identified decades ago, and not only that, the solution, what needed to be done, was more or less clear as well, a reduction of manure surpluses, a reduction of CO2 emissions. Why did it take so long before political action was taken? Apparently, technologies and financial means are not sufficient conditions. And it is my view that we need historians and humanities scholars more generally to lay bare some of the obstacles and conditions for change. Historians are able to lay bare deeply historically rooted patterns of thought and explain sudden changes therein. For instance, what is considered an environmental problem that has changed drastically over the centuries. the rise of the concept of the environment or climate change is, in the first place, a conceptual history. And if we once more take a look at the nitrogen crisis, its long history of very, very gradual change and tensions building up can only be understood, I would argue, by recognizing the pervasiveness of ideas about the role of farmers as the cornerstone of society, about the importance of food security, and about the link between the agricultural sector and the national interest, especially in the case of the Netherlands and a country like France. These ideas have their roots in the immediate post-war context, so food security can really be the origins of this idea of food security can really be found there, but also the exceptional nature of agriculture as an economic sector. So the idea that farmers' incomes needed to be secured, that is one of the founding principles of the common agricultural policy. But also much further back in history, such as the role of the farmer or the spiritual benefits ascribed to those people working the land. That has a very strong sort of mythical dimension to it. We need cultural historians to lay bare continuities and shifts in public notions about farmers, about food and sustainability against the backdrop of the immense transformation of the agricultural sector in the second half of the 20th century. And it is my hypothesis that it has been more difficult to frame agriculture as an environmental issue due to such long-lasting paradigms, more so than has been the case for other sectors such as energy, mobility, and industry. Now, the history of rural and agricultural governance and the environments happens to have my interest, and I get all excited when I get to study political conflicts about land use that are underpinned by clashing notions of what constitutes nature or who gets to speak in the name of the environment of future generations. Now, I can totally imagine that your interests lie elsewhere. And there are so many ways in which we as historians are able to make a crucial contribution to understanding and questioning our present ways of thinking and doing, of producing and consuming. To give some examples of topics that environmental scholars here at Utrecht University are working on: the evolving nature of human-animal relationships, the various ways in which societies respond in the face of ecological disasters, the interconnection between climate change and conflict, the history of multinational companies, the role of climate fiction, the literary genre of climate fiction in making climate change something that can actually be imagined, and the historical development of biodiversity, to name but a few. Now, these reflect the very different, the very diverse strengths that encompass environmental history. So both the historical development of, let's say, the natural environment, the physical environment, biodiversity, climate, the interaction between humans and the natural environment, but also the politics, the culture and social history of the environment. In the past few years, students have made cutting-edge contributions to the field. If I may use this opportunity to put the spotlight on some of their work, several of them have analyzed how non-state actors, including environmental organizations, but also firms like drinking water companies, have shaped and contributed to the emergence of environmental policies and regulations. These organizations have reached a point where they now, 50 years or 70 years old, would like to take a moment and look back and reflect back upon their own histories. They're opening their archives to students. They're approaching me to ask if I have student interns or students who would like to do research and to find answers to questions such as, how have they developed since their founding? To what extent have their aims and strategies changed? What have been dilemmas that they have faced, for instance, between lobbying and taking to the streets, between focusing on topics that are of concern primarily to people in the global north, here in the Netherlands and Europe, and the global south, between holding individual consumers responsible for animal harm and environmental degradation, or putting pressure on the state to regulate firms. And of course, the most important of soul-searching questions. What has been their impact? And you can imagine that that is a really difficult question to answer for historians. Now, this is research that current and former RMA students have carried out, are currently carrying out, such as Hanna de Korte, Lucie Vos, Celeste Morton, Guus Wieman, Hans Rodenburg, Yannick Balk, and several more. Given that the environment and agriculture, fisheries, regional development, and also biodiversity protection are supranational policies, meaning that they are policies that are made on the level of the European Union and are binding on member states. Looking at the topic of the environment tells us a lot about the evolving nature of European governance as well. Think about it. Isn't it curious that British farmers voted in favor of Brexit and yet wanted to keep their agricultural subsidies? You may remember that fun was being made of this in the Netherlands when Cornwall farmers voted in favor of Brexit and then wanted to keep their agricultural subsidies. And we may laugh about it, but it seems an urgent question to me, urgent question to answer to me. So why is it that despite these subsidies, they were in favor of Brexit? While it sounded awfully silly when the leader of the House of Commons in the UK recently told us the key is we've got our fish back, there are now British fish and they're better and happier fish for it, which is absolutely laughable in the sense that I've never heard of fish who have a specific nationality, and they tend to be known for crossing borders. But this might also tell us a lot about the symbolic importance of fisheries and fishermen, both to the European project as well as to identity questions in the United Kingdom. And these are things we are not able to understand when looking at European integration as solely a matter of balancing costs and benefits. One of our former students, Luc Ritmeester, wrote a fascinating thesis about how and why the position of Dutch fisheries organizations towards the European community changed over time and became increasingly negative. The main reason he found was not so much the fisheries policies and the EU themselves. They were particularly dissatisfied with the fact that the world around them had changed. As the conservation of fish stocks, visvoorraden, became more important, they became disgruntled that fish, rather than fisheries or fishermen, became the main focus of policies. The increased influence of ecologists and environmental organizations meant that they no longer had the sole access to the fisheries minister or the commissioner of fisheries in the European community, but had to share the pie with other stakeholders. By addressing such questions, it appears we not only get a better understanding of the politics of nature, but also about pertinent questions such as why do certain groups hold such negative views of the European project, and how have European policies impacted their lives and livelihoods? Now, this brings me to my last point. I hope to have convinced you that historians can contribute to present-day debates. They can reveal the historical trajectories and roads not taken that have given rise to the situation as we know it today. They may also offer food for thought by highlighting the very different ways in which human actors have engaged with their natural environments in the past and in other parts of the world. An increasing number of students seems to share this view, and I come to this conclusion comparing the topics that you now write your theses about as compared with a few years ago, and also the topics that you organize symposia and conferences about. And I'm happy about this development, for I strongly feel that you as students, as this generation, have important questions to ask and stories to tell. Questions that those who grew up with nuclear energy and polluted rivers in the 1970s, or acid rain in the hole in the ozone layer in the 1980s, like myself, may not be able to raise, because it would mean that they would have to question certain taken for granted truths about how the world works and functions. A crucial way of doing this is to further foster collaboration between students and teachers. Within such a broad research agenda, there is a huge scope for you to come up with your own topics of interest and questions. It aligns with our mission at this department to offer research-informed teaching and to carry out teaching-informed research. Wouldn't it be fantastic if the next research parade would offer presentations by teams of students and teachers The time seems right. A general audience shows an increasing interest in the history of the environment. Several recent media articles have applied historical perspectives to topics such as the climate crisis and climate change reporting some 2 weeks ago, I think. So let us take up this challenge and write the environment into history. Thank you. Okay. Well, that is a really interesting. So the question is, how do we navigate in the clash between the new ecologists looking out for the environment and the old ways of farming? How do we move forward? I must say that I am not in the position, nor do I have the expertise to answer questions that are specifically related to the, let's say, the nature of the agricultural sector, right? So I'm interested in the politics, but what is an important dimension, I think, an aspect of the question that you have asked is the politics of this, is that if we are to believe media reporting, which is of course always kind of keen on conflicts and on sensation, that polarization is really, has really increased and has led to escalations. And to some extent, of course, that is true. But again, we really need to ask ourselves the question, who are these groups or these farmers that we see who are mobilized and out onto the streets, or who do groups such as the new Farmer Defense Force, who do they really speak for, right? And to what extent are the images that we see, do we take them as sort of as the reality? So when groups state that they speak in the name of the large majority of farmers, is that really the case? And I think the problem will be bigger if we sort of automatically assume that that is the case. At the same time, I thought it was interesting that the Dutch newspaper Trouw carried out a poll among farmers in the Netherlands, where it turned out that actually a large majority is convinced of the fact that the agricultural sector and their ways of doing of farming need to be changed. So there, it could be that there is more common ground or more conversation, more dialogue possible than one would sometimes think on the basis of what we see in the media. A second question that I would find interesting as a historian is, and I spoke about this with Hans Schouwenburg, also one of our teachers, and it was also a student of ours who looked into this already, the history of consultation between nature conservation interests and farmers' interests, because that also goes back quite a long way into history, at least in the 20th century, and that is also really interesting to see. So, what have been the forms and the shapes that these consultations and these dialogues have taken shape? When have they actually worked, produced productive outcomes, fruitful outcomes, and when has that led to clashes? So that would be the dimension that I would be interested in researching, and if you feel that that is of interest to you too, then that is really an invitation to you to join in this effort. I note that there is another question: how do we get society to listen to environmental historians? How can we be more proactive? It's a very good question, and I think. How do we get society to listen to environmental historians? That sort of presumes that we first need to convince society that environmental history is important in the first place. But it is my experience, especially in the last, not even 10 years, maybe 5 years or so, that 5 years ago or 7 years ago, I really had to sort of explain, environmental history. Isn't that kind of a marginal topic? And why would you want to focus on that? And isn't it too narrow? And can you really work on this topic for several years to come? Whereas now I have no problem explaining that, the environment history and the environment is really a relevant thing to study. So it's easy for me to explain to my relatives, for instance, or friends, or this question of why are transitions so difficult? And I think there the point that we need humanities scholars, again, and I'm sort of repeating myself here, but also in conversations with other disciplines, with beta scholars or with social scientists who are studying transitions. When I say that we need to look at historical past dependencies to understand some of the obstacles, or that it's important to look at how food, for instance, has been framed in discussions. Is it a commodity? Is it a sort of source of identity to certain groups of people? Is it considered a human right? That the question of which frame it becomes dominant in policy discussions, that is actually has a very strong influence on the outcomes of policies. So these are all very sort of humanities dimensions, I think, that need to be studied. And really, I would say that again, it's my experience in the last few years or so that there is actually a strong interest in environmental history. So no worries about that. How can we be more proactive? That is, of course, another very important question. I think it could be, one of the things, collaboration. So the collaboration that I mentioned, working together with organizations, and I don't just mean environmental organizations, right? So I mean all of the actors that have been involved in sort of in shaping environmental governance or agricultural governance, or rural governance, or other topics that are related in some way or another to the environment, and work with them and organize projects and approach them. And you will see that they are really interested in their own history, in their impact, but also about in the question of, how can it be when already in the 1970s we made this point and we had the science to support us, I'm a bit distracted because at the same time I see new questions coming up. So, but these kinds of questions that I just presented to you, I think are not just my questions, but are actually questions that are shared among a wider public. Okay, comment for Liesbeth. I don't think that farmers and climate activists actually have different interests. In the end, we all want a healthy planet and livable income. I think, of course, I find it a little bit difficult to speak about, farmers in general or climate activists in general. What you see, especially if you look at farmer organizations, and that is actually one of the problems, is that, their success to a large extent depends on their ability to present the farming interests as a sort of homogeneous or monolithic, or uniform thing, whereas I don't think there are many sectors that are as diverse as the farming sector. So so there we see different positions, and the same, of course, is the case for the environmental movement, which is also, the environmental movement really doesn't cover the huge diversity within this movement, with organizations who are really about, grassroots mobilization, thinking that, more participatory ways of involvement really are key and are a precondition to becoming more sustainable, to reaching a more sustainable society, whereas other organizations are really much more about, professional protest organizations, which are not really interested in sort of the member democracy, but are interested in, going out into the streets, organize spectacular campaigns and actions, and thereby change public opinion. So, but I think that what you say about the overlap, the potential overlap in interests. So rather than looking at the differences and sort of assume that this polarization is there because inevitably these interests are opposite, I think that is a very good starting point, and sort of opens your view and your horizon to many interesting, again, historical questions. And I think that is what we need, really. So thank you for that.